Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about our work we've been doing on alternative training systems for Pistachio. Actually started this 7 years ago. It's hard for me to believe that, but we have a lot of collaborators. Myself and May Coulomb are the main leaders, but Elizabeth Fitchner's involved, Phoebe Gordon, Catherine Jarvis Sheen, Louise Ferguson, and then a bunch of people from my lab. And the trials we have three original trials in Kings and Yolo County. Kings site number 1 was planted in 2016, and it's Lost Hills on PG1 rootstock. Kings site number 2 was planted in 2017, Lost Hills on PG1 also. And then the Yolo site was planted in 2018, and that's Golden Hills on UCB1 seedling. And then we also put in 4 trials at Westside Field Station. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but we have Kerman and Golden Hills on both Platinum and UCB1 with all these same pruning treatments, so it's a really large trial. And our objective is to bring pistachios into bearing more rapidly at a lower cost with higher water use efficiency while establishing a strong tree structure. The treatments are the conventional, it says wooden stakes, but we actually use metal stakes at 2 of the trials just because we didn't have wooden stakes available at the time. The trial in Yolo County had wooden stakes for the conventional treatment. And then the modified central leader, we used 5/16 by 8-foot metal stakes. The trees were headed at 62 inches at the end of the first dormant season, and they only had dormant pruning, no in-season tipping, and no shoots were removed, but all shoots that grew more than 18 to 24 inches were tipped. In addition, we worked to recreate that central leader every year and left that longer than the other shoots. And then the final treatment was untrained, and that was done on 3/8 by 10-foot metal stakes, and they had no heading or pruning, and only limbs that were too low were removed. But this was done on all the treatments, so we essentially didn't really do any removal on those trees other than things that were in our way. And what we use for the metal stake treatments are these stretch ties. They work really well. They're plastic, but they have a wire embedded in them, but in the middle there's no wire. And so as the tree grows, they just release them, and they're very nice for putting in. When we were installing these, the grower, we were just pushing them with a pair of gloves, and he was out there. He said, boy, I wish I hadn't just bought 30,000 wood stakes. So it's really a lot easier to put these in, and they're reusable as well. This is the King's trial number 1. Pictures in each year. On the left side is the conventional, in the middle is the modified central leader, and on the right is the untrained. You can see the trees do look somewhat different over time, and this is a picture I just took yesterday. I could barely get in here. I had to walk all the way out there because I didn't want to get stuck out there. And this is the conventional, the modified central leader, and the untrained, what they looked like yesterday. I didn't get exactly the same trees as those other images because there were parts of the orchard that were too wet to get into. And we measured light interception with the light bar that Daniele mentioned in the orchards every year. We also did measurements during the in-season, but I'm not going to talk about that right now, but we followed the leafing out a couple different times. And this is the light interception over the years. You can see it's really not that different. It goes up and down a little bit. Part of this is because the untrained trees grow in alternate years, really. So they put on just the preformed leaves one year, then the following year they put on 3 or 4 feet of neoform leaves, and so they're constantly changing the amount of growth they put on each year. The first harvest in this site was in the 4th leaf in 2019. We harvested that by hand because the grower was not harvesting. And then in 2020 and 2021, we did a mechanical harvest followed by a second hand harvest to see how much crop. We didn't remove. The grower didn't do 2 harvests that year, in those years. And then the mechanical harvest in 2022 was done with a conventional pistachio harvester. And this is the cumulative yield from that trial, the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th leaf. You can see the untrained treatment has been consistently higher in terms of the cumulative yield, and the conventional the lowest, and the modified central leader in between. And this is the yield per unit light intercepted in 2021. So you can see that there's they're more efficient in terms of the amount of light that they're intercepting because you're not generating all this as much vegetative growth with either the untrained or the modified central leader treatment. This is the relative water use efficiency. This was actually in 2021, so we're putting on the same amount of water. So this is just the amount of crop produced per amount of water. And this is this percent removal on the first shake. So you can see there was no significant difference between the removal and the 3 treatments in this by the 7th leaf. And we found this every year. The removal has not been significantly different. Now this is the King's trial number 2. This is also Lost Hills on PG1 rootstock. And you can see these trees were quite a bit taller at the time that we started the trial. And you can see we removed a lot of the tree on the modified central leader. Up to 2/3 of the tree was cut off when we headed it down to the correct height. In the untrained, we just left the full height. And this is what the trees look like over the years, again with the conventional on the left, the modified central leader in the middle, and the untrained on the right. And then this is what they looked like yesterday when I was out there. You can see they look quite different, but actually if you go out there in July, you really can't see any difference among these trees. They look very similar. And this orchard was flood irrigated twice in 2018, once in 2019 and 2020, 3 times in 21 and 4 times in 2022. And this is the light interception. In this case, there were no significant differences. You can see by 2022, they're all intercepting a pretty similar amount of light. You also don't see quite as much of that. Neither of these first 2 sites have put on a lot of vigorous growth, so the last 2 years we haven't really done much pruning in the modified central leader treatment. And you can see what happened here. The modified central leader has essentially been almost unpruned the last 2 years because it hasn't grown that more than that 18 inches in order to qualify it for being headed. So by 2022, the yields on the conventional is significantly lower, but the other 2 treatments are similar. And this is the percent removal. Again, there was no difference among the treatments in 2022. And then the Yolo County trial number 3 was Golden Hills on UCB1 seedling. And these trees were nursery grafted. And we didn't realize it until after we had them planted and they started growing, but there was a lot of frost damage, and up to 50% of the terminal shoots had been damaged. And so we lost the leader on a lot of the untrained trees. The modified central leader, it would have got cut off, so you wouldn't have noticed it, and the conventional as well. And this is what the trees look like in November 2021 after pruning. So you can see there's quite a difference after pruning. This is what they look like in November before pruning. We haven't managed to get in here to prune yet because we've had, in Davis, we've had since Christmas, we had only 1 day with no rain until yesterday, I believe. So it's been just endless rains. And this trial's out in the middle of an orchard, so it's difficult to get out there. And this shows the PAR interception in this site. You can see on the right-hand side that box that for the untrained trees in 2020 and 2022 were the years that they were not putting on any of that neoform growth. So you can see the alternating growth pattern there. So in 2022, it had the lowest light interception, but then next year, this season, it will put on that extension growth, so it'll jump up ahead, so it kind of bounces around. This site is a lot more vigorous than either of the other trials that we have. And this is the number of pruning cuts. We haven't pruned it yet this year, but we counted the cuts each year, and you can see we made over 7,500 cuts approximately, and it was very similar on the modified central leader and the conventional treatment. We really didn't do any cutting on the untrained. But on 80 acres, this would be over 500,000 cuts you would make on either of these treatments. So there's a lot of labor involved in this. And this is a conventional orchard adjacent to our trial in Woodland, and you can see where they've done all this tying and propping branches apart, and there's a lot of work involved in all of that. In our trials, we had to tie up branches, usually one branch per tree, but you can see in the Kings County site number 1, we tied up 15% of it, had a tie on 15% of the trees, 42% on site 2, which was the ones that were very tall when we started the trial. And then in the Yolo County site, we had about 10% of the branches that we tied. And in this trial, we first did a hand harvest in 2021. There wasn't enough crop for the grower to harvest, so we didn't bring a harvester in. And you can see in 2021, we had about, I think, 9 times the yield in the untrained compared to the conventional, with the modified central leader being in between. And then in 2022, we did a mechanical harvest, and we essentially got everything off. These are Golden Hills, and these are brand new harvesters, and they did a really nice job, and there was almost nothing left when we went in for that second hand harvest 2 weeks later. As you can see, again, we have about the same ratio, still about 9 times as much yield in the untrained compared to the conventional. And the grower started harvesting this orchard, and he got about halfway through, and he realized it wasn't worth harvesting since the rest of the orchard was trained conventionally. The other 2 trials in Kings County both had modified central leader in the rest of the orchard, but in this orchard, our conventional training, I think, was much closer to the normal way that they're trained by growers, because we had the model of the conventional training next to it. We were told by quite a few growers who have visited our trials in Kings County that we didn't prune our conventional treatment as severely as the average grower. And this is the percent removal on that first shake in the Yolo County site. So you can see we pretty much got everything off, and there was no significant difference, again, among the treatments. And this is the commercial grading from that site. We didn't have replications because we only did 1 composite sample. We didn't have enough of a sample from the individual reps in the conventional to actually send a sample to the processor. And you can see the total edible yield was similar. The percent shelling stock was a little bit higher on the untrained, and the percent closed shell on the lower left was significant, was highest on the conventional and lowest on the untrained, and then the percent blanks was also highest on the conventional and lowest on the untrained. And this is just a summary of the percent removal on all 3 of those sites. You can see there was no significant difference on the removal on this would be King site number 1 would be the 7th leaf, the King site number 2 the 6th, and the Yolo site on the 5th leaf. Now, we also counted the flower clusters per tree each year, and we got really good estimates, especially in those early years of the yield, by just and we're trying to come up with formulas for different varieties and things, but it looks like you can get a really good estimate of the yield if you just go out and count the flower clusters just as they're opening up. It's fairly easy to do. It's easier than it sounds. We did this all the way up to the 6th leaf, actually, in the trials in Kings as well. And the other thing we noticed is that we had some untrained male trees, and these had 45 to 50 catkins. This was in the 4th leaf versus 1 to 5 in the conventionally trained trees. So you get a lot more catkins when you're not doing that severe pruning. And we also did another trial in the Yolo County site where we looked at the wooden stakes versus metal stakes. So we alternated down one of the rows in the middle of the trial that had the male trees. We didn't use that as part of the trial. And the wooden stakes tended to lead to smaller rootstocks is what we expected, but it wasn't significant, but it was also not a very big trial. And then we also did either leaving the rootstock sprouts on or removing the rootstock sprouts. And we found that leaving the rootstock sprouts on tended to result in larger rootstocks and smaller scions, which is, I guess, what you would expect. And we also went in and measured the rootstock and scion. There wasn't enough crop in the 3rd leaf in the west side trial to justify harvesting, but we did measure the rootstock circumferences, and you can see that the rootstock was always bigger than the scion. And Golden Hills was larger than Kerman, and the platinum-rooted trees were larger than the UCB1 trees. And the first harvest should occur this coming year. It looks like there's a fair number of flower buds out there, so I think we'll be harvesting it this year. Now, one of the things you have to look at, when I was mentioning, if you go later in the season, the trees look quite similar, but they're actually really developmentally different. If you look at the conventional tree on the left, that whole shoot grow out that same year, so you have this tremendous growth that year, whereas in the untrained tree, this is the year that it just put on the small amount of terminal growth. You can see most of that shoot is 2 years old and only a little bit of it's 1 year old, so that's why you get your production quite a bit earlier. We also think it's going to be easier to manage these if you have to start hedging them, because you're going to be doing the cuts down low. If you think about a conventionally trained tree on the left where you have this round ball, you're making a big cut if you have to start hedging. Whereas with the more central leader shape, you should be able to do the cuts first from lower down, possibly just by hand on the ground, but it will be a much easier job to maintain them. Now, we've also been trying to look at where these blank zones come on pistachio shoots. And the first is this response to this to heading cuts, and I'll show you a little bit later what I mean. Because you head them every year, you don't see that. But if you stop heading, you really see there's a dramatic blank zones on those trees. And the second is the yellowing of the shoots due to the overly wet conditions. This is what Julia mentioned in her talk. We found that these shoots that turn yellow in season are the following year. Those zones that were yellow will be blank. There's no buds. Sometimes the buds come out a year later, but not very often. So you really want to avoid that condition where if you start seeing those yellow elongating shoots, it means they're too wet, and you definitely need to back off on the water. The example on the previous slide was actually in the flood irrigated orchard, and that one irrigation that year happened to be right at the wrong time. And so we got a lot of those blank zones from those yellow shoots. These are the different symptoms of overwatering. On the left is the shoot level I just talked about. And on the right is the leaf level. These symptoms are very similar to what we see in walnuts, where you get these wrinkled up leaves and this bronzing and then misshapen leaves. If they're overwatered just as the buds are emerging, you get really misshaped leaves. This is most common really in the second through the second, third year, I would say. You don't really see this very often in older orchards, unless it's a really extreme case. And this is what happens when you tip these trees. You generate these two buds really close to each other. And what we found is that this is where most of the breakage occurs in conventionally trained older orchards, usually at the 7th or 8th year when you're starting to finally put a lot of crop on these trees. So I went out the first couple of years I started working on pistachio, and every time I saw broken branches, I would go out and see where those came from. And I would say 95% of those breaks were where that first tipping cut was done. Occasionally it's lower down where the first heading cut was done, but it's much more common to where the tipping cut was done. And this is just a conventional orchard we were working in, and you can see those are all broken limbs that almost all of those came from that first tipping cut. When you have these untrained or the modified central leader trees, you have much better limb connections and much stronger branches. We don't expect to see breakage in these. And this is what I was talking about earlier, that you can see in 2019, this tree put on a fairly long elongation. Then in 20, it just put on the preform leaves. And then in 2021, it put on this 3 or 4 foot long shoot. And then in 2022, it put on a very short shoot. I didn't get in here to get the pictures because it was too wet, but they just put on a little bit of growth. Individual shoots that did not elongate last year will elongate this year in the year. So some of these trees actually filled in shoots in between. And we noticed that when these shoots in the fall, these shoots that elongated last year, the long shoots, those defoliated much earlier than the ones that elongated in season on that same tree. So I think it's because they probably had all their carbohydrates stored already. We did some sampling, and I haven't got the data yet from Matchy to look at this in one of the grower orchards we were working in Kings County. And this just shows, just so you get an idea of those, you can see those numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those are all the preformed leaves that were formed in the bud the previous season, and then the neoform growth is just taking off there when you see that growth. Usually around June 1st is when that neoform growth will start growing. So pretty much if you're not pruning, you get that every other year. And so growers think that they've stalled out when they see that, and they want to go in and cut it, but if you just patient and wait, they will elongate the next year. And this is the same sort of data on a prune conventionally trained tree, and you can see there you're cutting it each year, so you get about the same amount of growth each year. Now we have a number of ongoing grower trials, and this is a Lost Hills Modified Central Leader trial that the grower from our trial in Woodland has up in northern Yolo County. It's a really nice looking trial. And that's what they're doing in their new orchards. They're mostly planting a Modified Central Leader. And then this is a trial in Kern County where they have Modified Central Leader trees and untrained trees versus conventional trees. This is in Yuba County at a nursery, and these are Golden Hills and untrained and rootstock scion trial. So they have it replicated with different scions and rootstocks. This is a third leaf Golden Hills orchard that a grower in Kern County is doing. This is a fourth leaf Golden Hills untrained trial in Kern County. And then this is one of the older untrained orchards in Kings County, fifth leaf. And then this is an eighth leaf Modified Central Leader orchard in Kings County. And then this is the oldest one that we have. It's a little bit different system because we hadn't quite worked out the system at the time, but this is a 12th leaf Modified Central Leader orchard. They really don't look that different by the time they get to this age. You have to look carefully to see the difference. Now we also get a lot of questions from growers asking if they can convert from conventional training to Modified Central Leader. So we've done a couple of trials. This, in the left-hand side is a third leaf conventionally pruned orchard, and then on the right-hand side, the grower stopped pruning. Well, he did about 40 rows in the middle of the orchard, but the pruning crew got in there and thought they missed them, so they pruned almost all those rows before they noticed that they had done it. So we only had about 3 rows left with the unpruned. And then this is another one we did at Westside Field Station. We have guard rows, and then all those guard rows, we're stopping pruning the Modified Central Leader trees starting in the third leaf, or after the third leaf. You can see on the right those long blank zones in those shoots that occurred when we stopped pruning. And then on the left is the prune treatment. And then we have this other trial on the left. Oh, that's the same one, actually. The third leaf Golden Hill. And then on the right, that's a fifth leaf Golden Hill. So we have some trees that were conventionally pruned that we stopped pruning and in the fifth leaf. And you can see those big blank zones in those. And these would all be cut off normally if you were pruning conventionally, so you wouldn't see this. But if you stop pruning those trees, you'll get these blank zones. We don't find those really cause problems. We also get those when the elongation's happening really fast on the untrained trees. And they don't, even though they looked pretty bad, by the second or third year, you don't really see those anymore. And then this is, oh, that's the same one, sorry. And then this is a trial that a grower in Yolo County did. He's just stopped pruning a conventional orchard, so I haven't been out to look at it this year. This was taken last winter. So the summary of all the sites is the Modified Central Leader and the untrained had larger rootstocks, stronger branch connections, taller trees, more early fruiting positions, earlier yield potential, higher water use efficiency, and the untrained trees had much lower training costs. I think that's all I had. I wanted to thank the Pistachio Research Board and the Presidential Endowed Chair for Nut Crop Research for funding this work, and also our grower collaborators. In Kings County, Jeb Hedrick was the grower, and this year Donnie Rose came in. Because the growers has the over-the-row harvester, it was almost impossible to weigh the nuts, so we had Donnie Rose came in and harvested both of these Kings County trials for us, which was a really big help. And then the Yolo County site, Shane Tucker's the grower, and Bullseye Farming, and are the managers, and Nick Edsel is the manager, and they've been really great collaborators with us. So that's all I have. And that was exactly 0 seconds left. I don't know if I guess I don't have time for questions.